Okay, please remember that as the Ming come in, they've replaced the Yuan. Yuan, Yuan dynasty, which were the Mongols. And as they've replaced the Mongols, they've tried to go back to what was traditionally Chinese. In this case, one of the things that's traditionally Chinese is Confucianism. And so we see as the scholar gentry comes back, remember I said Confucianism was big into education. We also see some other Neo-Confucian. You guys remember what Neo meant, right? That's right, it meant new. It was Greek for new. That's right. So what were some three aspects of Neo-Confucian thought that went on during this time? Well, one of them is youths are inferior to elders. That's what I've got underlined here in the first one. And women are inferior to men. Some people, remember, Confucianism believes very much in social control, in the sense that what they want is they want social order. They really believe the individual subjugates themselves to the group or to society. You do what's best for the group, not necessarily just what's best for yourself. And in order to keep people in line, some of them wanted draconian methods to keep people in line. Draconian comes from an old Greek Draco emperor, or tyrant rather, from the old period who passed a series of laws that had very harsh punishments, and thus the word we get today is draconian. It comes from Draco, the Greek tyrant who had very strict and harsh punishments. For example, a teacher cut off the head of a student that disagreed with them. Wow. Wouldn't you like to have that power? If you're the teacher, of course, not if you're the student. And as stated in number one, women were definitely kept inferior under Neo, that is new, Confucianism. It just took Confucian ideas to the next level. Next, in what ways did the Chinese control items of trade during this age of growth? Some of the big trade items were porcelain, silk textiles, tea, ceramics, lacquerware. Tea, I've got starred there a little bit because tea was quite interesting. Tea could have grown in parts of India, had the perfect climate for it, but the Chinese were incredibly protective of tea and actually tried to prevent anybody else from getting the tea plants out of China. In fact, the British actually sent in a spy, a guy who got out tea plants once and they died, and then went in and again and got out tea plants again. Tons of American silver. Remember, the Spanish are getting silver out of Mexico and Peru. Are getting tons of American silver out and bringing it to China for these goods. Europeans could only trade in two places, two cities, and the merchants, the Chinese merchants, obviously benefited. But the government benefited as well. That's what number three is about. The government benefited because they got taxes and officials got bribes and slash favors for them. Next up, early in the Ming is the Zhong He goes off on a series of expeditions. Now, Zhong He is a eunuch. A eunuch is a guy who, a castrated male, essentially. Eunuchs were popular around the court because the idea was they couldn't have family, so they didn't have loyalty to anybody but the government, and hopefully themselves a little bit, but mostly the government. And also they could not impregnate women of the royal court. So they were quite popular, and Zhang He was one of those guys. He is sent off to explore the lands. He wants to proclaim the glory of the Ming Empire, that is, to show off. He went to Southeast Asia and eventually the east coast of Africa. I've got a map up here with his voyages. See him down here in Southeast Asia. Goes to India, goes all the way down to Africa. This was a huge flotilla of ships, probably on the order of at least 40,000 people traveling on these ships. They were quite large and it was quite an expedition. But the Chinese eventually cut it off. Why? Well, we're not totally sure, but the best guesses are, number one, it was expensive. Number two, Zhang He came back and told them, the people of China, that there really wasn't that much out there that was worth interacting for. He'd really gone to gain tribute. He gained tribute, and the purpose of the mission was done, and it was too expensive. And number three, you remember I mentioned at the beginning, he was a eunuch. And as a eunuch, they were popular around the church court. They also gained quite a bit of power around the church court. And it may have been an effort to cut off, all pun intended, cut off the power of the eunuchs from in the Chinese government. Last slide before we take a little break. We start to look at the Ming, the fall of the Ming, and our last slide on China. So the Ming eventually start to fade, and you're going to learn in the very next time period, at the beginning of the next time period, they'll be replaced by a group from Manchuria we call the Qing Empire. But the Ming are on their way downhill. Why? A lot of it sounds familiar to us. Number one, incompetent rulers in the throne. We've talked about that before, right? We talked about that with the Safavid a little bit, but some with the Ottomans, and even goes back into Rome. It happens a lot. Rampant corruption of officials. Well, we definitely remember talking about that before. Remember the Ottomans? Some of the local officials were keeping tax money for themselves. It happens in the Ming. Growing isolation of weak rulers. That sounds like some of the other places. Remember, they just live in the palace, live the good life, and they get soft and don't know what to do. Eunuchs, I've already mentioned them, start to dominate court politics, and so there are conflicts between the eunuchs and the royal families. And public works start to fall apart. Now in China, public works means canals and flood control. Then when those start to fall apart, it really creates bad problems for people. Also, peasants are suffering. And that means that in China, remember, unlike the rest of the world, in China, peasants revolt because they say, hey, listen, the government has lost the mandate of heaven. We're suffering. The government is here, under the mandate of heaven, the government is here to help make our lives better. And if our lives stink, then the government clearly has lost the mandate of heaven, and we have a right to revolt. And they will, and the Ming government will actually invite in the Manchurians to help them out. The Manchurians come in and say, hey, we don't have to help the Ming out. We'll just take the place over ourselves. So those are 6 of our reasons. Incompetent rulers, corruption, isolation of these rulers, eunuchs, which are unique to China and their role. Eunuchs start to dominate court politics. Public works, specifically flood and irrigation and canals, start to fall apart. And your peasants are suffering, so they will revolt. All right, next up, Japan.